All right, Gemma.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here with us at the second workshop of the Debating Transnational Governance workshop series, which has been organized by the students of the PhD in Transnational Governance based at the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences of the Scuola Normale Superiore in Florence. So the idea is to get different perspectives on topical issues within transnational governance. And in fact, there has been already one workshop on non-state armed actors and rebel governance. And there will be other two, one in June and one in September, one on security interventions and the changing character of war, and one on cultural diversity. Today, instead, the broad discipline is political economy, and we want to discuss the role of private actors within transnational governance. And we want to unpack the topic on different theoretical, but also empirical perspectives. So ranging from the political power of global corporations to specific sectors like finance and public services, particularly water. So we're very glad that we have three speakers helping us to do that. First of all, Eleni Tsingou from Copenhagen Business School, and then Emanuele Lobina from University of Greenwich, London, and then John Mikler from the University of Sydney. So the first hours will be devoted to the speakers' presentations, while the second hour will be of general discussion, where it will be possible to address questions to the speakers and to the audience. So I don't take more time, and I leave the word to Eleni to start off with the workshop. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you in advance for listening to me and not looking at slides in parallel because of various issues in the last 24 hours. That has not proven possible. I really enjoyed thinking about my presentation for today because it sort of got me thinking a lot about how much of what I do is really about private actors, how much of what I do is really about private governance, and also really see how my views about these issues have also inevitably changed a little bit over time. And some of that is always down to, you know, the fads in the discipline. When is it popular to think about the state and when is it less popular to think about the state? But some of it is also really down to the sort of groundwork of the empirics of what we do and the sort of the nature of the world of finance as well. So in the very early, I mean, sort of as a sort of starting PhD student, it was, you know, things like actors such as credit rating agencies were especially popular in terms of thinking about, okay, we have these new private actors in the field. I remember having long discussions with my PhD supervisor about the sort of merits of otherwise of studying the International Accounting Standards Board. So there was a very clear understanding that there was a big standard setting movement happening, which had big private sector involvement. But how precisely we could start thinking about private authority and private governance issues without being able to actually process, sort of undertake the sort of following the process of these policy-making situations was far from straightforward. And there's always been work on the sort of traditional lobbying side of things, which is really big on finance and increasingly transparent. And you know, the other big issue, of course, is this technical expertise. So when I started doing this work, I was very much thinking, okay, yes, finance is highly technical, and you can only really have actors with strong claims to technical expertise being in charge of governance arrangements. And inevitably, you will have the sort of traditional lobbying because finance, even at its most benign, is highly political, and the distributional consequences are inevitably important. So to me, there was also something else going on, and that was the time where, you know, where there was a lot of focus on the Basel standards, but there was also focus on a lot of the new financial instruments, great focus on what was happening with over-the-counter derivatives in particular. And this is how I got involved with the Group of 30 on the one hand, and came close to actually studying in the Institute of International Finance, which have been still to this day a much more traditional private actor to look at in this context. Because the primary question that drove the work was, you know, why it is that the rules look the way that they do. When it comes to standards, the standards of global finance, the rules of global finance, why do they do the work the way that they do? And also, why do they do a little bit as if private actors themselves had written them, especially as we came closer to the financial crisis and the distributional consequences were slightly more obvious to all observers. So this is how I got started with this particular work. And I focused in the end, I settled on the Group of 30 because to me it was simply a more interesting outfit, because precisely it wasn't about traditional lobbying. But also because it did this work on over-the-counter derivatives, which satisfied the sort of nerdy side of my personality the best. So then there were two specific types of questions in trying to understand, okay, first of all, what is private about all this, but also what does this tell us about shifting patterns of governance? And one of those issues were sort of theoretically, what happens when you put the great and the good in global finance in one room? How does that change? Does that change anything? Do we have confirmation of existing patterns? Do we have new knowledge arising? What actually happens in these circumstances? And then more, perhaps a combination of sort of the conceptual and the empirical undertaking of doing this. What is, if we had to look at a sort of narrative arc of trying to explain how it is that private actors can claim authority in these issue areas, how does that come about? Is there a start, a middle, and an end, or is there a start and a middle at the very least that determine whether some type of actor is seen as a legitimate voice in governance and in the governance of this particular field in particular? So two things. So on the first aspect, what happens when you have this type of group coming together? How do they operate? I hope that my research shows this also from the writing, that what you get is something a little bit more than socialization, training, and familiarity among the great and the good. Those things inevitably matter a great deal, and there's a lot of fantastic literature there about the role of the social norms in these patterns of socialization, training, etc. So this is really to complement some of these processes and to try and understand how it is that they happen in practice. And what I find is that, yes, shared training is especially important, but there are some other aspects that matter too. One is, again, a sort of empirically easily to observe shared experience of public and private, sort of having spent time in both the public sector and the private sector, that we see in this field quite a lot. But perhaps more, more interestingly for the content here as well is this two shared beliefs in one, independence from government. So this community came to gel at a time where it wasn't really a question of public versus private, but rather, can we keep governmental, electoral, and highly politicized issues away from how we discuss the rules and standards for this issue area? So independence from government is one thing, but also a certain dedication in transnationality. And this is a term that is, we might still disagree on what exactly it means, but certainly beyond, it is not just a decoupling from a national setting, but it is a dedication to a policy space that is not quite a level in the traditional governance terms that we know. So So that is one thing. And the other thing that I find when it comes to the mechanisms then, so these are sort of some of the shared attributes. What are the mechanisms when these people come together? What does this mean to have what I call a club at the center of some of these rule-making moments? And that is through the shared experiences. What I argue is a sense of vocation almost to the cause of financial governance. In practice, that means defining, delimiting what are the appropriate parameters for what can and cannot be governed in financial governance, as well as the content of what is to be governed. So this is where I think what is quite interesting, and I would argue is also a contribution of this work, is that it allows us to relax some of the assumptions about groupthink, intellectual capture, this sort of uniformity of thinking. Once you go into these into studying the mechanisms through which what is appropriate gets to be agreed on, you actually do find a lot of disagreement, a lot of debate about economic ideas, occasionally about distributional ideas. Now, I do not mean to claim that these are the sort of debates that would satisfy all of us who are in this virtual room, but they are certainly not the kind of debates that are either apolitical or devoid of controversy. There is scope for disagreement and debate. And that to me also opens up some opportunities for thinking exactly, it's not just what can and cannot be discussed, but who brings it. So, and as we know also from the literature, it's not just who is in the room, but who gets to speak, who gets to actually do the work when they are in the room that matters. And it's, thankfully we have good literature on this also from other issue areas. It's also a case for me of relaxing some of the assumptions of whether to what extent there is strategic behavior involved here, or a deliberate plan in coming up with a particular outcome in particular financial governance issue areas. And there too, I think this is where the narrative arc of how it is that private actors assume responsibility or get to claim authority and be seen as legitimate for doing so by others matters so much. And in my work on the Group of 30, it all started in a highly technical issue of clearance and settlements in securities. And I am very blunt when I say that among the members of the Group of 30, really no one cared. For them, it was a way to get funding to do something that both the public and private actors in the field wanted some work done on, and they were really used much more as a sort of hub with a particular sort of prestige to get people to answer surveys. But this is but one step towards something that becomes a lot more significant in due course, because gaining legitimacy and being seen as doing a good job when it comes to a highly technical issue makes the next issue much more easily defined in technical terms. And I argue that this is what happened with over-the-counter derivatives, which to many, even at the time, the distributional consequences were much, much greater. Before we actually get into my work into something much more intensely political, which was the use of systemic risk concepts and definitions in how one started thinking about capital requirements in the context of Basel II. So this is what I wanted to say really about the concept, but I think it also says something about the way in which the ways in which we do our work, because a group such as the Group of 30 is very interesting to get lost in regardless. I mean, it's, if you're that way inclined, you can have hours of fun studying what they do, looking at who they are. You live very close to, those of you at SNS are very close to the EUI archives, where Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa's papers are, and he has an abundance of notes on these, on the Group of 30, and I had a lot of fun in there myself. But it's not enough. You need a policy process to be able to study, to actually answer these bigger so what questions. And so I think we need to always keep that in mind when we are doing research, because it also does tell us quite a bit about how we can combine the sort of process tracing in policy terms, our interview work, our archival work. This is an issue area where these kinds of, especially with the benefit of time, these issues become quite manageable. But the so what question is a bigger question that I myself struggle with or deal with a lot of the time, because yes, we can describe a lot of these interactions, and I'm going to finish with a couple of words on my work on revolving doors with Len Seabrook. We can say yes, these things happen, but why should we care about these as scholars of private governance? It's not about determining whether a particular policy outcome is linked necessarily to specific individuals whose primary material or other interests can be traced. I mean, we could do this work, it would not be as interesting, or certainly, it would not have such a broad IP or political economy appeal. So, what matters to me with that research is being able to identify what kind of training, what kind of skills, what kind of experiences, what kind of professional experiences are in demand by the relevant actors. To be able to actually shed light on some of the, when we are talking about the market wanting particular skills, who are we actually talking about? It's those sorts of questions that I think can be answered with this kind of research. It's less about the focus on individuals, even though a lot of what I do now is prosopography with sequence analysis and network analysis, and much more about what are the patterns that we see emerging about not just training, but about, I think, increasingly professional experiences, this shared transnationality, or whether there is actually a step back from those issues, and having a better idea this way about what kind of work experience matters. So for me, this is what I understand by private governance. It's not governance by private actors, but it is the way in which the different types of private actor material, interest, ideas, etc., get to be part of a broader discussion, get legitimized in these discussions, because this is what different actors want and need or claim they do. So I will stop here, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can move on to the second, our second speaker, Emanuele Lobina.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to Gemma and all the organizers for inviting me. It's very kind, and I very much look forward to the conversation, starting from today and possibly, in future as well. Now, can you just tell me, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. Right. So I also share Eleni's feeling that reflecting on the topic that you have given me has been very interesting, challenging, rewarding. So I would like to thank you for that. Now, before I get into the thick of things, you can see this is home, University of Greenwich, along the river. Just a couple of words about myself and where I'm coming from. Then perhaps I would also like to talk about maybe defining a couple of terms. Now, I have been working at the Public Service International Research Unit, PSRU for France, which is part of the University of Greenwich, the University of Greenwich Business Faculty, for longer than I can remember, more than 20 years. And now PSRU looks at the experience of public service reform in the Global North and the Global South. My interest in particular is and has been the water sector, water supply and sanitation. And initially I start as a neighbor empiricist, if you want, researcher, in the sense that all my research was applied policy research and certainly empirical. It is with time that I start to, gain an interest in theory and to start reflecting from a theoretical perspective, as well as empirical, around the issues of governance and public service reform. Essentially, we're talking about the public versus private debate, privatization and other approaches to water service reform. So definitely power and private monopolistic interest have been at the center of my concerns for a very long time. And I think that it is important to say that just a second. Let me try to organize my my thoughts. Yes, let's leave this aside. A bit of a blank moment. We have the oh yes, that's what I was importantly, if you want to understand where I'm coming from. When I was doing this empirical research, policy research, this was at a time, we're talking about the late 90s, for example, when the dominant thought, and in a sense, to paraphrase Eleni's words, the hegemony of the time was influenced by a number of theories that were predicting the greater efficiency of the private sector. And that is why I put them under the label of government failure theories. They were predicting the failure of government relative to the private sector. And when I was doing this empirical research, I was not finding, confirmation of those expectations. So that's how is it that I started to gain an interest in theory. And essentially, the last few years of my have been dedicated to trying to lay the grounds for a theory of public service reform and water service reform in particular that tries to be a real-world theory, because I couldn't find, confirmation of those expectations of greater private sector efficiency and the desirability of privatization, for example, in the real world that I was observing. So that is, where I'm coming from, where I'm trying to go to. And today's reflections around issues of power and private monopolistic interest in the water sector, in a sense, are part and parcel of my reflections in the last few years. I would like to express my gratitude, acknowledge gratefully the financial support of the Independent Social Research Foundation, who funded my Political Economy Research Fellowship 2017-2018 around those issues. Two of the outputs are among the recommended readings. You have the URL of one. You haven't got the URL for the other because due to copyright constraints, I cannot publicly circulate the book chapter on strong and weak lock-in of water governance outcomes. But I think that this copyright constraints should end towards the beginning of the new year. So we have the policy at PSRU to put all our and we always have we have been for quite some time to post our research online. So that's what I will do with pleasure. Other selected references. 2013, 2016, before my fellowship, but just to tell you that this is the time when I started to reflect more in theoretical terms. Okay, a few definitions. First of all, governance. Even if I haven't put it here, I couldn't find the space, but it come back later. I think that I define I'm not the only one. I join others in defining governance as networked government beyond the state. So performing the functions of government, but not involving not only government but also other actors. So networked government beyond the state, and this, in a sense, is a definition that chimes with other concepts, and say, for example, collective action. There are also those who think that, after all, the idea of governance is just putting old wine in new bottles. And so, for example, public policy has always been about governance. But we'll leave those debates for later. Now, as a bit of background, what can I tell you? First of all, the water sector. We're talking about essential services. They're provided under natural monopoly, some more than others, but natural monopoly definitely shapes the interactions between the various actors, market, state, and civil society. It is a sector that has known a growing presence of private actors for the delivery of services, starting from the 1980s in particular, even if there are historical cycles, but starting from the 1980s, there's been this resurgence of privatization in its various guises, including public-private partnerships. And but we should think about a sector where public actors, due to the essential nature of the services, are very much present. And in fact, the public operators are the majority of urban operators, also depending on how you define them, how you count them, or where and when. But I think that, generally speaking, we can say that the majority, if not the overwhelming majority, of urban water services around the world, both the global north and the global south, are being delivered by public operators, public enterprises. Things have changed to a certain extent. Now, with more parent society from the 1940s onwards, there is this resurgence of anti-collectivism in social theory, in economic theory. And the mainstream theory, government failure theory, that predicts superior private sector efficiency, and that includes transaction cost economics, industrial economics, and others, has gained momentum, let's say, coming from a long way, but around the 70s, 80s. In the 80s, particularly, thanks to the emergence of the Washington Consensus, Reagan and Thatcher. And the Washington Consensus takes different names. New public management, perhaps, is the more familiar name in Europe. And it is effectively the encounter of neoliberal policy together with mainstream economics. Now, I will give you 3 propositions, and I will try to, well, to reflect around these. The first proposition is that theories of government failure are under-socialized and depoliticized accounts of public service reform. That is, okay, we know that they do predict superior private sector efficiency. One way in which they can do that is that they effectively disregard 2 important factors, 2 important features of the real world. One is the presence of social relationships, under-socialized, therefore, and then the importance of power and conflict, hence the depoliticization of these theories. So as a result of the dominance, the hegemonic dominance of these theories of government failure in the last 30 to 40 years, and the fact that no alternative theory has emerged to challenge them, we are bereft of a real-world account of public service reform. This is my motivation, effectively. That's where I'm coming from. And what I try to argue is that power is central to a socialized understanding of real-world water governance. Of course, in a sense, this is a bit of a tautology from what I said before, but just to say that power is important, that we should think about why that matters and how that matters. I will start with what I call Willig's paradox. And Willig is a proponent of industry economics. He's one of those theoreticians who say, you know, it's important to privatize, it's certainly desirable to privatize public services compared to, you know, retaining the sector under public ownership and management. And the paradox is in the fact that Willig says insulation from self-serving political interference, and you can see here some parallels with perhaps public choice and other theories, but they do have much in common, those government failure theories. Insulation from self-serving political interference results in the superior efficiency of regulated private enterprises over public undertakings. So if we have private enterprises that are regulated, and you know, political interference is taken away and private trumps public, hands down. And this insulation arises from the fact that the institutional framework supporting privatization, which includes regulation, according to Willig, guarantees the profitability of private enterprises in order to attract investment. So this guarantee of profitability serves, in a sense, to make private enterprise more efficient and to leave corrupt politicians or self-serving politicians out of the picture. And the paradoxical nature of this reasoning stands is in the fact that, as I suggest in 2013, the private sector is capable of, at least in the water sector, but not only, the private sector is capable of taking advantage of asymmetric power. The private sector in the real world, so not the world of an armchair philosopher or an armchair economist, the private sector is capable of taking advantage of asymmetric power in the real world and of favorable institutions that are there to guarantee this profitability. In order to extract net gains, some people will call them, you know, to maximize profits. Mariana Mazzucato stresses the importance of saying, you know, no, we're talking about rent extraction, but you know, you get the gist. What I'm talking about. So extracting net gains or rent while public decision makers face high costs due to this institutional framework to steer private agents away from an undesired course of action. So if the private sector is not as efficient or as desirable as Willie claims, then public decision makers will have quite a hard time, will have difficulty in trying to remedy the situation. And so as a result, it is the institutional framework expected to promote efficiency by shielding private operators from non-commercial demands that allows private operators to abuse of their monopoly power.
Emanuele, sorry to interrupt, but as you asked, you have 5 more minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Now, this paradox is also an iron law, because what we can see in the real world is that the repertoire of tactics that transnational corporations have at their disposal in order to do all that is quite varied, and they do take advantage of asymmetric power, often revolving on greater expertise and greater knowledge to do that. For example, we're talking about anti-competitive practices. It might include corruption as a form of regulatory capture, adventurous bids, which is playing with figures in order to make your bid more attractive, and it would really be in systematic renegotiations of those terms after the contracts are sealed. Symbiotic relationships with regulatory authorities that are there to make sure that that privatization succeeds. Legal and extra-legal conflict. And we can talk about different cases here later on with public authorities. So it's important to have a socialized definition of power. Power has the capability to influence the actions of others by mobilizing resources, tangible resources, and intangible resources in an asymmetric relational context. So the importance here not only of resource dependence, but also the relational. And network positionality is quite important. It's important, I think, to think about coalitions of actors who are, interacting. Sometimes, they cooperate. Some other times there is conflict. And it's important to understand why do they do what they do. For example, it's important to look at actors' motivation, actors' power, and also the institutional environment where they are, moving. What constrains and facilitates or enables their actions. So social embeddedness is important, institutional embeddedness is important. When we're talking about theorizing water service reform, all these things have implications for strong and weak lock-in of reform outcome. And so just to close, a socialized account of water service reform should pay attention to power as the means of action, motivation as the directionality of action. And one important difference between the private sector and the public sector, a specific motivational feature here of private firms, is that they pursue profit maximization as their raison d'etre. Now, this is not necessarily the case of other monopolistic actors like public water operators. So if I have a few seconds to conclude, another perhaps broader theoretical implications when you are theorizing about water governance is that while certain literature prescribes inclusiveness as an ingredient of good governance, if you want to have good governance, you have to be inclusive in shaping your network. The merits of alternative changes to the composition of a policy network, for example, actor inclusion and actor exclusion, depend on how these changes affect the solution of a given policy problem. So, for example, if you realize that privatization is not desirable and new remunicipalized services. Remunicipalization is reverse privatization. Of course, you will have to exclude some actors and include new actors, for example, excluding old private actors and including new public actors. So I just point you to more recommended readings perhaps later on for the discussion, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And we can move on to the third speaker, John.
Okay. So I have a presentation as well. And I hope everybody can see this. Yes, you can see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Lovely. Okay. First of all, again, thank you very much for the invitation to be here today. It's wonderful to have so many people in attendance. If we can't actually be in the same room, at least we can all share our ideas and thoughts in this way, which is wonderful. So I'm going to be talking in more general, I guess, framework terms about how I see private authority and the potential for private governance. So whereas the other speakers might have spoken in a little bit more, specific terms in terms of cases, I'm talking more generally. And today, what I'm going to be speaking to really is mostly chapter 5 of my book in 2018, The Political Power of Global Corporations, and a little bit of chapter 2. So mostly the chapter on private authority and private governance. But just to show you the cover of the book, here it is. The reason I do this is not because I just want you to go out and buy it and read it, but also so you can see the cover we agreed on, which was deliberately constructed so that you could see, like, is there private or public governance going on? Is the state operating through corporations, or is the corporations working through their states? Or is there more of a symbiotic relationship in which they're simply entangled, so that we can't really separate what is public from what is private, the corporations from their states? So there's a little bit of an attack on the idea of transnationality throughout my book as well. In fact, quite a bit of a one. So, all right, that's the cover. The main point of what I wanted to do in it, which I hope I did, was to re-embody corporations as political actors, rather than talking about them as market actors, as economic actors, as interested in sort of working through market forces, rather than, say, Marxist critiques, which look at class relations as a way of understanding their political power, rather than just focusing on the role of the state and the way in which states work with their corporations. There's a good literature in all these areas. But I thought, even if you're an adherent to a particular approach or a particular ideology, it's possible to step back and look at corporations seriously as not just economic or market or class-based, but actually as political actors, and also to re-territorialize them. I'm not going to talk so much about the re-territorialization aspect of them, the fact that they actually come from particular countries and particular regions, and therefore there's a geopolitics to the way in which corporations exercise their power. I'm mostly going to focus on the re-embodiment of them. And to say, first of all, that they are in a position to be in authority. There's certainly been a liberal, maybe neoliberal, if you like, agenda that's been accepted and celebrated or critiqued and bemoaned. It's all about the idea of free markets and how markets should be in charge, for better or for worse. As Margaret Thatcher said in the 1980s, there is no alternative to the free market. Well, any evangelizing today in this vein should be contrasted with a reality that looks more and more out of step with it. Because the reality is that we live in a world of corporations, very big corporations, not so much working on the basis of market forces, but on the basis of market control. Because any industry that you can think of is usually controlled by about 5 multinational corporations at most. And in fact, a third of industries have one corporation that accounts for more than 40% of its sales. And if you look at the corporations themselves, the top 20 corporations in the world have sales that are greater than the combined output of 138 states, This changes from year to year, so these figures are a little bit old, but they'll still be shocking or surprising, or maybe you sort of think like, yeah, you're not surprised, whatever year you look at. Greater than the combined expenditures of the bottom 166 states. So what we're talking about is very large entities, but not just entities on their own, as the other presenters have pointed out. We're talking about the networks that they control as well. If you wanted to be an economist, you would say, look, you can't compare sales with output or sales with expenditure. You should actually be combining it with value added. But that would miss the point that the corporations we're talking about sit on top of networks and control supply chains. In other words, they control the value adding process all the way up. So it's important not to think like an economist or an accountant, but as someone who takes politics and political power seriously. They control these networks, and they also therefore control international trade. Today, global corporations account for 80% of the global trade statistics that get quoted. In other words, we're talking about intra-firm trade, trade that goes on within corporate supply chains, not trade between countries. And that means rather than arguing around the benefits or otherwise of Ricardian comparative advantage, what we're talking about is these corporations that are in a position to determine, in fact, to govern the kinds of relations over labor, over the environment, and other conditions that happen within the supply chains that they control. I mean, for example, a company like Nike actually produces nothing itself. Company like Apple as well, other than intellectual property, contracts out the whole production to a vast range of producers in the networks that they control. So that's what trade is about. Overall, this means that market forces, as I'm saying, I'm laboring the point a bit, are not in charge. Corporations are. The visible hand of the state has been replaced by a visible handful of corporations. And if we talk about market power and market realities and that kind of thing, well, there's more than a debate that should be going on about whether or not markets should be free or not. It's clear they aren't. And if that's the case, then we're talking about corporations, big corporations, as political rather than market actors. It's interesting, you know, to go back and read some of the earlier globalization literature, people like Susan Strange. I love reading her work, but I find I agree with it less and less, because she talked about the way in which power has become disembodied in the global economy, the way in which markets are now transnational, the way that the global economy is, and came out with, you know, terms like, she said, and I'll quote from 1996, "There is a diffusion of authority away from national governments that has left a whole of non-authority, ungovernance, it might be called, in the world." Not so, because global corporations are in a position to wield the political power that they have. And this is going to resonate with what Eleni was saying, actually, a great deal. They wield it in instrumental, structural, and discursive terms. So this three faces of power framework is not new to anyone who's a scholar of politics, but I use it in terms of looking at business power, corporate power, as I'm proud to say a disciple of Doris Fuchs, who wrote a wonderful book about this a few years ago that actually changed the whole way I looked at it, because I was thinking, do you use a liberal lens, a Marxist lens, a nationalist lens, a post-structuralist lens? Actually, you can use any of those lenses, but this is a very useful way in which to look at the political power that corporations have. So first of all, instrumental power. This is about relations that corporations or their representatives have with governments and regulatory authorities. We see it in the lobbying activities of corporations and the huge amounts of money that is spent on lobbying. But also we see it in terms of the relations that elites in the corporate sector and in government have with each other. For example, in the United Kingdom, 46 of the top 50 publicly listed corporations have an MP as either a director or a shareholder. The result is that Owen Jones, who's very critical of corporate power, he says British business and political elites are not distinct entities, they are deeply intertwined. So we're talking about this revolving door analogy of lobbyists, of money spent on lobbying, and also of relations between elites in the corporate and public worlds. Their structural power is to do with not just sort of influencing government or having influence over agendas, but actually being given what they want before they even ask for it, with actually being in a privileged position to suggest the kind of policy settings and the kinds of regulatory outcomes they'd like, because they have control over underlying economic processes. The things that I was saying before about their market control, this doesn't just mean that there's an illusion of choice if you're a consumer in economic terms. It also means that there's a limit on the kinds of policy options that can be actually considered as well. And when we talk about their structural power, the point I also want to make is that it's not just about the power and control they have over particular industries, but increasingly there's this intersectoral consolidation going on, so that we see companies, corporations that are controlled across industries, as well as the networks of production of goods and services within them. But the big one, the big prize that they want is discursive power. And this is where legitimacy lives. This is the idea that if you want to actually talk about freedom of speech and who's responsible for regulating it, if your answer is Facebook and you think that that's a good thing, that's about discursive power. If you think that corporate social responsibility is a good thing and really important and to be encouraged, then actually it's not just about control of economic processes, it's not just about relations, but about discursively constructing the idea that as a corporation, as a corporate leader, you have expertise and you have the right to make the rules. So this is actually where private authority starts to become private governance, because it means that interests don't need to be pursued. They're created in others, as Ainsley Elborough, my colleague, would put it. Stephen Wilkes, power that is believed to be exercised responsibly comes to be institutionalized as normal or tolerable. It means that truths are created about, the way in which that what is good for corporations is good for society, so they can be given the regulatory levers to be put in control of and can set them themselves. So a generalized perception that the actions of an entity, in this case corporations, are desirable, proper, and appropriate within some socially constructed system. So, okay, how do we move, from the, this idea of instrumental, structural, and discursive power to get from private authority to private governance? I think it's important to sort of think about authority as lying between coercion and negotiation, between force and trust. Think about it in those three faces of power terms, and then to think about it as being on a spectrum. Now, as I move up this spectrum, and I'm sort of like leaning quite heavily on the work of people like Tony Porter, Claire Cutler, and Virginia Haufler, who've done a lot of work on this, especially in the late 90s and early part of the 21st century. The idea is that you start with, private authority, but my argument is that at some stage that private authority starts to be translated into private governance. It's not just different levels of authority, it's at some stage that authority becomes not just a force for governance, but governance itself. So starting off, informal industry norms and practices. I'm using PowerPoint here. You'd be surprised if I didn't. There are alternatives, but people will say things like, have you got a PowerPoint display? Because they expect that you're using the Microsoft suite of software. And that's not surprising, because in actual fact, I've got the figure here, but I can't find it at the moment. In actual fact, something like 80 or 90% of the of desktop personal computers in the world use Microsoft's operating system. So often informal industry norms and practices sort of are a form of authority. But moving up from here, we have coordination services firms like the credit rating agencies, the professional services firms, the big four. And the point about these is that these organizations, or rather these companies, are not simply neutral or technical in what they do. They are actually promoting accounting and financial management standards that look like something. And it could be argued, what it looks like, but generally it tends to look like the Western Anglo-Saxon liberal market economy kind of model of the way in which economies should work or are expected to work. Moving up from there, production alliances, subcontractor relationships, and complementary activities. This is very important for issues like environmental sustainability, also for questions of forced labor or unfree labor. It's the point about the way in which these industries are controlled by large corporations that have control over what goes on in their supply chains. And it's also, as a result of this, why you shouldn't be surprised that cartels exist. In fact, you should expect cartels to be pervasive because of the market concentration and control that industries have. Setting production standards, setting prices, deciding the way in which markets are carved up between them. I mean, honestly, you should be surprised if there's arm's length competition going on in any industry at all, apart from a very, very new one. Moving up from here, we have business associations that coordinate and formally represent the interests of their members, like the International Chamber of Commerce, or in the environmental field, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which Nina Kolek says talks and acts like a preceptor mundi, in other words, like a global teacher. You can see how we're getting not just control, not just relations and structural power, but moving up to discursive power. And then right at the top, you have private regimes. Probably the best example of this is the International Organization for Standardization, the ISO, which has a membership of 163 national standards associations. It makes not just technical standards about production, but about management, about labor, about the environment, and in actual fact, it legitimizes production and services in all sorts of ways. I'm nearly out of time. I could expand on all of these, but to wind up, really the point that I'm making is that this is all related to legitimacy, and actually it leads to sort of like, really it's very important to focus on the corporations themselves. Not just to sort of like, you know, talk about in general terms about market forces, about social relations that go on, but actually what these corporations, these household names are doing, because it's very important. And there's one missing, and there it was hiding, it's Facebook. Why is this important? Because increasingly they're ascribing to not just the doctrine of what Milton Friedman would have said in the early 70s of the business of business being business. In other words, the social responsibility of business is to maximize profits. Increasingly, they say they're about social responsibility, about solving the world's problems. And this is very important in political terms, because if they're going to be the governors of the world in which we live, what's going on is not just a debate about whether certain social responsibilities are a good thing or a bad thing, or what kind of things are being done. What's going on is a struggle over the central question in politics, which is who governs. And here's one possible answer to it. This, I couldn't believe it the first time I saw it in The Economist newspaper, and it's run a few times. It's an advertisement for an MBA. Learn to be CEO of Mars, Inc., as in the red one. And like, I looked at this and I was like, you know, eating my toast and having a boiled egg with breakfast, and I nearly couldn't swallow. I can't believe it. This is actually what they're selling. What are they selling? Don't say you weren't warned. Mars won't have a government, it will have a corporation. It won't have citizens, it'll have shareholders. It won't have democracy, it will have corporate governance and corporate social responsibility, and maybe shareholder activism. So if you want to see what the world looks like, maybe that's where we're going with private governance as a result of private authority. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. And thanks everybody for their presentations. It's been very insightful and very interesting. I think we'll start our Q&A session. First, we have prepared a few questions to be a bit more didactic and sort of the PhD organized workshop. We wanted to ask one general question to everyone, and then maybe have more individual questions to each presenter, after which we will open the floor to the audience as well. And for the first question, let me open it just for a second. Yes, so basically, as we introduced the workshop series as well, they are part of the Transnational Governance PhD program. And all of you have covered a bit, quite a lot actually, about the topics of governance and private governance or corporate governance in various ways. But now maybe with a sort of just an initial question, quick question to maybe reflect a bit on it. What would be the transnational part of this governance? How would you see the transnational aspect of private governance in our modern society? Yeah, I think this would be it. And I don't know in which way, if anyone has some kind of an answer already, otherwise we can go in the same order. But I think John is raising his hand.
Yeah, my point would be that there's not a lot of it about. That transnationality suggests that, like, you know, borders are no longer relevant and things pass through them as if they weren't there. The European Union is usually given as the best example of this existing in practice, but even then it's problematic, isn't it? I think the reality, and this is why the second sort of like plank, if you like, of what I wanted to say in the book, was there was a need to re-territorialize corporate power. Because if you look at where the big corporations are based, there's never more than about 10 companies. And, 10 countries where they are based. And those countries have great power. So to talk about the way in which somehow corporations or corporate power, you know, private governance has somehow slipped the boundaries of nation states, I just don't buy that argument. If you're anything but one of the most powerful countries in the world, you know what this sort of like transnational power, transnational governance really looks like. It comes from somewhere and it goes somewhere and it comes to impact you. And the best example I can think of this is when the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement was first being negotiated. The Obama administration said, you know, that we, meaning America, was going to make the rules for trade in the 21st century. And there used to be a spreadsheet which you could download from the US Trade Representative, which showed the 600 companies and business associations the drafts of the TPP had been shared with. Now, unless you believe that somehow the Obama administration was really about making America weak again and surrendering sovereignty to global forces, you'd have to think that there was some kind of sharing of sovereignty, some kind of sharing of power with, you know, private entities in the drafting of that agreement, because anybody else who wanted to see what was in the draft had to have it leaked to them. But these big companies and big industries had access to it. So I think like this argument about transnationality sort of like shrouds where the power comes from, where it goes to, and power interests that are still alive and well in geopolitical terms in the world.
I could go next because I mean, so you obviously have to think about transnationality elements because that is, you know, that is what you do. Officially, it's the title of my professorship. So my job is to reflect on this a little bit. And what I would say is, so I agree with John with a lot of what he has said, and I think again going from the retreat of the state and sort of this strange epoch to now. I mean, we have added a lot of nuance in exactly what we understand, but the state, I think there's also a lot of elements about how we understand different state level actors that come into play and that's also why I share a lot of I share a lot of what John has said as well. I would also go as far as saying that there was a time where perhaps there was this perception that there was something special about finance. And I think that assumption has also been, I mean, I think there's more argument about this than there used to be. The financial crisis and the very much state-led bailouts had a lot to do with you know, reconsidering some of those ideas, and similarly, I mean, it's you know, when we're looking at what's going on in the world of virtual assets right now, we can see how much is at stake and how much is very much still state-based, even if we can't quite understand the territoriality element in such stark terms. Where I think the transnational element still matters is how the actors themselves consider who their peers are. So when it comes to who has the right to be in the room, who is making the rules, whose knowledge matters, who has the right, what kind of actor is seen as a legitimate training provider. So that those elements of legitimacy, which I would say, again, I would not equate them with elite networks. There is definitely a network element there, but they are much more about who actors consider to be their peers. So you have audiences, sometimes you have direct stakeholders, you have shareholders, you have constituencies, and you have peers. And I think on the peer front is where you see it the most explicitly, the transnationality element. You also see it across the other levels. But this is what I would say. I have given up on trying to think of the transnational as a different kind of level. It's not a level. We have very defined levels, and then we have particular, again, I will borrow from geography and use the sort of the world of the terminology around space in a different way, because it is how we understand the sort of overlapping communities in which actors are part of. But that's what sort of 20 years of thinking about this has led me to. Sorry.
Yeah. Thanks. Now I have to say that I agree with John definitely that national borders have not dissolved, and I agree with Eleni about this look at, let's say, I from my experience, from my vantage point, looking at the empirical experiences on the ground, I prefer to talk about multi-level governance. And when we're looking at the role that certain organizations like the European Union or the World Bank or others have played in promoting private governance, privatization, and even contributing to a certain hegemony of neoliberal thought, and there is, you have to expand, the horizon, the perspective. They are playing an important role, and this is what I was thinking about when I was saying the importance of network positionality. So the intangible resources. One of the last paper that I was recommending, suggesting, was a paper thinking inside the box, why the World Bank is not learning. We were reflecting about an incredible moment in, we've been at international conferences many times, and there was a period in 2006 at the World Water Forum in Mexico, where the World Bank was doing something extraordinary. They hadn't done that before. They were saying, oh, maybe, there has been some irrational exuberance about the merits of privatization. Really, the World Bank, are they saying that? And then they were about to say, we are going to open up to the public sector. It's important, we're going to support the public sector. We couldn't believe it, at the conference. What happened then was that the private multinationals issued a statement saying, well, you're either with us or without us. And just this threat of, withdrawing their legitimacy in terms of, we're not going to support your discourse any longer. We are going to, so network positionality, the fact that these multinationals were saying, okay, don't count on us to sell whatever policy you're going to sell them, made wonders. The World Bank changed position, not overnight, but almost overnight. Maybe they did change face, but effectively, when you look at the policy of the World Bank, what they had announced did not really materialize. So I think that this multi-level governance, which has also a global, international, I don't know if transnational in the sense of a myth, a desire, or if it is something concrete, but it is there. You only have to how can I say? Well, you know, I've been talking in very general terms about the relationship that I try to analyze, but these relationships effectively remain the same. You know, whether we are talking about symbiotic relationships between regulator or decision makers and actors on the ground at the level of public service delivery, etc. They remain there. They're just translated into other arenas. Let's say that thinking about another role that the European Union has been playing recently in terms of shaping the possibilities of policy, they play as gatekeepers. They play as gatekeepers of what is admissible and possible in terms of policy on the ground, sometimes against the will of member countries, like, for example, imposing certain policies on countries like Greece, who are not, you know, perhaps as central to the European powerhouse as Germany or France or others. Or, for example, opening up the debate to civil society, as in the recent case of the ECI, the European Citizens Initiative, the first one being on water, and people, European citizens, asking for remunicipalization, which is the opposite of privatization, among other things, water as a human right, and the European Union saying, well, you know, that's not our idea. So redefining the terms of the debate to basically backtracking on something that they had offered in the first place. So they are gatekeepers of, you know, what is admissible, what is possible, and you know, it's a complex game where you know, it's not only multinationals, of course, but I think that this is why I would like to talk about. I like to talk about hegemony, and I like to talk about a long-term project that comes from the Montpellier Society, where there was an anti-collectivist project, you know, promoted by Friedrich Hayek and others, and Milton Friedman was there, and you know, others were there, which has then been popularized by think tanks. So again, you know, you have another level, global vulgarization, popularization of certain ideas that then have been distorted to create this hegemony. Anyway, I'll leave it there, sorry.
So now we can open to the public. I see, I also have some questions myself, but I think Phil has a raised hand. He can ask the question, and then we also, I see Moschella and Phil, please.
Right, can you hear me now? Yeah, I just have a few basic points. I'll try to be quick, but they go through a lot of issues of structural change, which I think are important here. But on the technical side, I'd just like to say that the International Political Science Association Research Committee number 36, Political Power, which John knows a lot about, Eleni knows about, has been debating some of these issues since the 1980s or the 1970s, and we continually have you know, meetings around these issues. And they also publish something called the Journal of Political Power, which has a lot of articles around these kinds of issues. So I won't go any further on that one, but it seems to me that what we're talking about here is something that comes from originally from the ideas of James Rosenau back in the 1990s of what he called fragmigration, which people haven't really talked about, although they talk about to some extent the dialectic of globalization and fragmentation. In other words, there's a lot of structural change going on, which isn't just about corporate power, but corporate power is a very important dimension, as John pointed out. And transnationalization, of course, is important in that kind of context. But there's also the issue of the restructuring of production itself, with people like Fry and the technology trap, and Haskell and Westlake in talking about capitalism without capital, talking about the way in which different kinds of firms and different kinds of supply chains and different kinds of production processes are actually moving us away from, distinctly from the second industrial revolution of large mass production firms basically located in one particular country, to a variety of multi-level network relationships between what in some ways are kind of highly fragmented forms of production, whether you're talking about going from high technology to third or fourth industrial revolutions. I mean, I don't really want to talk too much about that, but it seems to me that in that kind of context, the state as such becomes what in some of my work and some others we call the reactive state. The state is trying to control what's going on without actually having the same kinds of methods of control that it had during the second industrial revolution. And another issue that I'd like to ask Eleni about is the debate about financialization, because it does seem to me that if you look at the financial markets and the financial structures of the world, we're actually moving to an area where investment is moving away from the real economy into a financial economy, which is, above the surface, and where people, it's just money to make money, or financial alchemy, as several authors have called it, and that's leading to greater inequality, and that's leading in some ways to the slowdown of the real economy. Now, just to mention that a couple of months ago, in an issue of the Journal of Political Power, a couple of us had an article on something called heterarchy, which a number of people have a term which a number of people have used. And it seems to me that the concept of heterarchy, in which you've got a kind of combination of sectoral and functional distinctions here, creating meso, micro, and in some cases macro political structures, which are disaggregated in the same sense that Slaughter talked about the disaggregated state. But it's all at different levels, above, below, and cutting across the state. That's where the dialectic of globalization and fragmentation comes in. Now, I hope what I've said makes sense to you, but I think it asks a lot of questions, and there's some questions that need to be pursued further than what we've done here today.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to take a few more questions now, and then
Sure.
So, Manuela.
Hi. First of all, let me thank Eleni, Emanuele, and John for having accepted the students' invitation. So thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to hear your presentation. You raised so many interesting points. I have several notes, but I will try to be brief. I have two specific questions for Eleni and John, and then a general question to all of you. Eleni, I was thinking, and it's really more a curiosity about that, the way you put your interest in private governance. And of course, we have chatted about this in the past, and for disclosure, Eleni and I are also good friends. But you said that what is of interest to you is this idea that private interest ideas get part of the broader governance framework, right? It's not so much that private interests or ideas have an impact on a specific policy outcome, and that's what makes it interesting. And I completely agree with that. But at the same time, I think that this definition begs another important question. That is, who are the relevant actors on the recipient side, right? That make it possible for private interests and ideas to become part of this broader governance framework. Because at certain point, it seems to me that you kind of emphasize the role of markets, and now Phil's question on financialization also pointed in this direction. So do you think that in the current context, market actors, what market actors think is much more important than, you know, public institutions, public governments, whatever? So who are the, sorry, the relevant actor? And as for John, I find it fascinating, the discussion on multinational corporations. And while you were talking, I'm sorry, I have to drink a cup of water. So if you can go on, and I will be back, but I need some water. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Let's, Lorenzo, can you make your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, okay, so my question is also related in a certain sense to the financialization, and more specifically to the growth paradigm. So the idea is how this growth paradigm has a role in the mechanism of allowing greater asymmetry of power within the market, and therefore considering discretion to big corporations and other private actors. And the second thing is related to the role of efficiency versus fairness, and if it's the loss that we are accumulating in fairness is in a certain sense a good trigger for evaluating our growth paradigm. Thanks.
Lorenzo, just clarification. What's the paradigm you said? I didn't get.
It's like growth.
Ah, growth. Oh, okay. Manuela, can you?
Yes, as I wrote, I survived. Sorry, I needed to drink a glass of water. John, as I was saying, a very fascinating talk. I mean, your works are really interesting. While we're talking about multinational corporations' power, I was really thinking, where do the challenges for this power lie, right? Because, I mean, probably I'm reading about, you know, tech giants too much just in the papers, right, in the economies. But to me, and check me if I'm wrong, because you have much more knowledge than I have, probably, I mean, the most serious challenge to these corporations lie from within. At least 2 decades ago, right, if I think about the tech giants, you know, they were the disruptors, right? Internal dynamic market competition among big companies that led to a complete reshuffle of the big tech giants. And so I'm thinking, is it possible to expect a similar reshuffle in a couple of years? Or do you see the challenges for the types of power that you talk about to emerge from somewhere else? And then really just a general question, and also thinking about the fact that it's a PhD workshop, if the three of you have any idea about where do you think the debate is evolving? So where does the literature is going to? If you have any suggestions for the students, because as Phil was reminding us, this discussion about public authority, public-private governance, at least started in the 80s, 90s. And if you have any idea of where is it going, what are the kind of hot issues, the feds, as Eleni also was mentioning in her presentation, that, you know, PhD students might think about to take advantage of and write about. Thank you.
So now, who wants to start answering?
I can start, and then
Okay.
and then I can answer the easy bits, and then leave the rest to the others. So on you know, thank you very much. And I think when we are thinking about, and certainly when I think now about my work on global finance, it's quite difficult to delimit where, you know. So what I've tried to talk about is how do, you know, this stuff around the club mechanism more specifically. However, On your question, Manuela, I think what matters there is not that the recipients of the policy outcomes are irrelevant, but rather that sometimes the recipients, those who are in charge of shaping policy or coming up with even the sort of the agenda for policy, are there not because they are necessarily the right actors for this particular policy issue, but because, say, they happen to do something right before, or they happen to be there and they haven't been discredited, or they have been discredited, but there's no one more technically astute than they are. So in that sense, I think there is constantly a mismatch between the recipients, the policy recipients, and the policy, the providers of policy options, so to speak. It would also be, I think, unfair, however, for me to say that nothing did change post financial crisis in that respect. And I think when we look at those environments where the kind of club mechanisms that I talk about do happen, then you also see a much greater questioning of the public purpose of finance. And therefore, at least a broader range of recipients of policy is at least acknowledged, if not actually acted upon. On the financialization issue, I think the two are linked. I mean, the main thing there, I would say that I can say from my work, because of course I read a lot of the work on financialization with great interest, is precisely where does risk lie. And a lot of the literature started off with on questions on sort of pension provision, for example, and the like. But now we can talk about development solutions when it comes to digitalization of finance. It applies to how we think about green finance and pensions. It really applies to a much broader ways in which all actors interact on a financial level. When I say all actors at all levels, from the sort of micro level up to sort of central banks and beyond. So that is the main issue there that I think is most important. And that assumption of risk at the individual level or the organizational level has not been challenged. And the distributional consequences of the risk assumption at that level have also not been actively discussed, except I think slowly, tentatively in the area of green finance, where again I think we should not underestimate the role of central banks in what is going on in green finance. Now, is to cover part of your question, Lorenzo, on the growth paradigm, is I don't know that any of the actors I talk about claim efficiency. So I'm trying to think through what the trade-off would mean for them in terms of efficiency or fairness. And I think claims to efficiency, if you think of finance as sort of an efficient allocation of resources, I think those are not as loud as perhaps they were. So the growth paradigm, I don't know that this is actively challenged anywhere, but there's certainly a lot of work that is happening, and where you do see a repurposing of public actors when it comes to thinking through these issues, especially through the role of central banks. And whether the central banks will have to rely primarily on the private actors or whether governments will step in, I think that's the big question right now, and that will help answer your question as well about what's happening to the growth paradigm. And Manu, sorry, you said the bigger issue, the bigger question about, maybe I will come back to that. I'll let John and Emanuele go on, and then I'll come back to that later.
Okay, so John now.
Yeah, there's many things to respond to. Manuela, I really liked your point, and thank you for your kind words as well, about where do the challenges for the power lie, or where do they come from? Maybe they come from within. I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. And I need to go away and think about it. I don't think I've got an answer right now. But I think there is there's the possibility of challenges that come from without as well. I mean, for example, you know, there was this argument, Elizabeth Warren made it in the United States, you know, a couple of years ago, that when you get very large tech companies that are essentially very, very monopolistic in how they operate, and they're providing services that used to be provided, you know, through telephony, mail, broadcasting, narrowcasting, content creation and provision, they're actually like the infrastructure of the 21st century. And what you do with them, you could break them up and pretend that you're going to create competition, but we know that that really won't work for very long, will it? And it won't serve the problem. It's better to regulate them in a different kind of way. So how would you regulate them? You'd regulate them as public institutions and forget the notions about efficiency and how they're profit motivated and market actors and competitive, because they're not. They're like public infrastructure providers. Yes, they want to make profits, but really they're about power and control. So that's not a sort of very radical kind of proposal, but you'd regulate them in terms of what they actually are and what they actually do. Okay, now is that possible? Well, it's hard if you're a country like Australia, because what the Australian government tried to do last year was to get tech companies like Google and Facebook to negotiate in good faith with content providers to pay for the content that they gave access to on their sites. And what Facebook did was it immediately, or rather after a couple of weeks, it said, no, we're going to do it. And then they did it. And they banned all news on Facebook. And if you tried to post something like that was from a newspaper or from a site, you know, like the BBC or something like that, they deleted it. They cut it off. And then they also apparently accidentally cut off access to all government information as well, including information about COVID. And there was such a huge response to this that it brought Facebook in particular, but also Google, who played a very interesting game. They sort of said, like, we're not bad like Facebook. We, of course, want to negotiate about this. Back to the bargaining table. And now that legislation is in place and the regulation is actually being enacted. So what am I saying here? I think powerful countries like the United States and powerful regions like the European Union are the places where that regulatory zeal, I suppose, has to come from. It's really important because weaker countries can't do it. That's in terms of challenges. For the students, I think it's really important to look behind the labels, behind the debates that are being had, and have different ones. For example, there's a great big argument to be had about whether trade should be free or whether trade isn't free. Is free trade a good thing, not a good thing? You know, that's a very blunt way of characterizing that debate. But the reality is that every single free trade agreement, from my point of view, tends to make trade less free. Because if you understand that the corporations are responsible for the trade statistics we see, and that trade is predominantly intra-firm, then every freedom for trade is freedom for corporations to gain even more power over the way in which trade operates. So we need to have a different discussion, come from a different perspective when we talk about what the purpose of regulation, multilateral agreements, and multilateral governance is in respect of trade, probably finance and services as well, rather than making it more or less free. I don't want to hog the time too much. Lorenzo, this actually goes to your question about efficiency versus fairness. It's really interesting that countries that had competition policies, or what's in the United States is called antitrust regulations, where all the mergers and acquisitions happened in the 80s and the 90s. All these mergers and acquisitions happened despite the fact that there were policies and regulations in place that were supposed to promote competition. And the argument that was used to allow the mergers and acquisitions was that it would increase efficiency. And of course, it's neither increased efficiency nor fairness. It's just given more and more control to a smaller number of larger corporations to set prices and have more control over their industries and over the products and the services that they offer, including to be less innovative and then to go to governments for handouts to say, you've got to actually help us and give us lower taxes, subsidies, and all sorts of arrangements that we desire because we're so efficient, apparently. I'm being sarcastic, obviously. Phil, you said so many things, but one thing I'll respond to was you said about the structural changes, and also to go and read the Journal of Political Power, which I'll go and do now a bit more than I have in the past. But on structural changes, yeah, absolutely. You know, the debates, you know, if we cast our minds back 20 to 30 years, were all about how footloose are multinational corporations. You know, there's a beauty contest going on. Will they get up and will they move? Will they sort of like move from one country to another if they don't get the conditions they want? That's a completely redundant argument now. You know, with all the way in which corporations avoid tax, with the new tech companies, that kind of thing, they can be based anywhere they like, and then they can get the policies and the taxation levels they want by pretending to be operating in various places. I mean, that's one aspect of it. And yes, look, I gave some very blunt arguments in my presentation, but I only had 20 minutes. Hopefully in the book and elsewhere, it's more complex. But that's one example of the way in which structural changes mean the debates that we're having should be different.
Please, Emanuele.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'll just react to Emanuele's invitation to think about where the debate is going, even if I will evade the question partially. I don't know where the debate is going, but I know where the debate should be going. And I do think that students and scholars of governance have a lot to contribute, certainly to a process of decolonization of the debate. Now, I'm using this term in the way in which would have been perceived perhaps more popularly before the Black Lives Matter. I mean, decolonization in the sense of reacting to the scientific imperialism of certain disciplines like economics on others, social sciences. And the reason why I'm saying this is, you know, just going back to what I said in the presentation. Part of the thoughts that, you know, we take for granted, like, you know, of course privatization is desirable, of course the private sector is more, are part of this baggage that comes from decades and decades of let's say of dominance of certain theories that tend to be reductionist. They take the complexity of social reality and they make it simple to the level that it becomes a caricature of reality. And then there are public policies that are shaped around these caricatures of social reality. So I do think that students and scholars of governance have a lot to contribute by reclaiming the complexity of social reality and the complexity of social economics. And just to give you an example, now Oliver Williamson, the father of a transaction cost economics, he stated in 1997 quite clearly that he wasn't interested in power. The power was a distraction, was a red herring. It was something that social scientists were, fixated on, but he didn't understand why. Because according to him, transaction costs are the key to understanding everything. Now, of course, going from an atomistic element like transaction cost to explaining the rest of the universe, it's quite a leap. So power was, taken out of the equation, and the complexity. Say, for example, we go back to the debate between Mark Granovetter and Oliver Williamson, and Mark Granovetter, basically tells Oliver Williamson, your work is under-socialized, Oliver Williamson, interestingly, responds a few years back in 1993 saying, oh, well, yes, I think you're right. All these things like path dependency are really important. And, the duality of agency and structure, how important it is. But then it says, well, but I don't do it. Someone else will. But I mean, this theories, transaction cost economics, but even the industrial economics I was referring to today, so Willie, even if they belong to another box, but they are part of this government failure theory, let's say program movement, if you want, that have been very influential. So they have shaped the debate. Their influence at the moment is not as strong as it was, say, for example, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but it is influential in another sense that they have reduced the space for alternative perspectives. And I think that what is important is that the PhD students of today and the contributors of tomorrow should try to reclaim the complexity of social reality. Because at the moment we have the theories of the 1990s who are less and less convincing, but they're not being replaced by something alternative. And the something alternative is, well, maybe it's too strong to say that it's nowhere to be seen, but I mean, I think that there is a program there to try to help us embrace and better understand the complexity of social reality, the complexity of economics that cannot be reduced just to transaction costs. Of course, transactions are important and costs of transactions are important, but I'm not convinced that that key alone can explain all of the universe.
Well, thanks, Emanuele. Thanks for all the presenters. I deeply agree with the concern with the reductionism with economics and other comments. I think do we have more questions from the audience? Or I don't see any more raised hands. I would do my own question now. I was thinking, I had actually a couple of questions, but then like seeing the comparisons between the presentations, I noticed something. For instance, while Eleni's work seems to blur the barriers between public and private in these institutionalities like clubs or these groups, John Mikler is very corporations are something closed and they have a power to be said. I would ask Eleni, how does she see this corporation? Because of course it is clear that, well, private, actually, when you go to this very micro level of the careers, expertise, and so on, you lose quite sight of this corporations as an actor itself. And how do you see this linkage? Is it possible to bridge in one research this linkage between the expertise and this micro level and this broader corporation level? What do you think?
Thank you so much for this question, because I think it's a very good question, because it goes to the heart of also how we study the things that we study. And the big danger with focusing too much on the professional groups is, as you say, more clubs, but depending on what you're sort of the concept du jour is a sort of losing touch with the material interest side of things. So just because you're not motivated by this point doesn't mean that the point doesn't matter. As well as the distinctly corporate aspects of the political action of corporations. So I think, to me, it depends a lot on how you study it, and this is where sort of other work that is being done among colleagues becomes very important about. So, Len Seabrook and Lasse Folke Henriksen are talking about sort of two-level networks where you're following the professional groups, but also the organizations in which they officially, to which they are officially affiliated. And then you look at sort of the networks in a particular issue area along those lines, and see where the professional incentives and the sort of the micro elements come into, and where it is that the organizational form actually makes a distinct difference. And that matters not just for the corporations that were on John's last slide, but also for all the intermediaries, brokers, whatever you want to call them, from management consultancies and beyond. But it also matters in methodological terms. So John spoke about how he's a proud student of Doris Fuchs. We have a proud student of John's in our midst at the Copenhagen Business School, a young scholar called Christian Henriksen, who is doing work on the maritime sector. And he's looking at corporate power in the context of the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, which is starting to get some attention in the news. The New York Times had a terrible write-up. Had a write-up about how terrible it is just last week. And there he's looking at how corporations are. So it's a UN. The IMO is a UN organization where you have countries being represented, but the delegations of those countries include business actors. So of course, being based in Denmark, this is a big deal for Denmark. And you have, so what Christian has analyzed is precisely how this corporate power plays out in the context of this sort of informal negotiations, where you have the sort of the front room and the back room, and the sort of the big plenary moments, etc. So it's not. It's a nice, I think his work is a nice way of bridging the corporate power outside these groupings, the lobbying, the resources, and those things that the sort of the public element of this, with some of the work that I do that is perhaps slightly more micro and sociological there. This is just to say, aside from, shout out to my colleague, it's also to say that it really can be done. And it can be bridged. And I think for students of IP, maybe less so for graduate students, but I think for undergraduate students of political economy and politics, keeping those links in the frame is very important.
And I should add, if you want to read some of the excellent work that Christian has done in this field, he has a chapter in this excellent book that came out in December. That's the wrong way round. And I'm a co-editor with Carsten Ronnet on MNCs in global politics, and he has a chapter on some of his research in there. But to answer or respond to your point, Nikolas, yes, no, I do treat the corporation as a political actor, and there is a focus on corporations, but yes, with limited time and sort of trying to focus on private governance, there's some nuances that get lost. I also do discuss the way in which corporations are institutionally embedded in particular contexts, and that's important. So that's socially and politically and economically. And in particular, as I said, the other plank of my book was the need to re-territorialize them. So that brings in sort of like debates about comparative capitalism, like, what a corporation does and how it's regulated and how it, relates to the state and also to society, depends upon the context in which it's operating and very much so where it's based. So whether we're talking about China versus the European Union versus North America, this matters a great deal as well. So there's a chapter on the institutional aspects of corporate power as well, with the way in which they're embedded in that. And certainly that also impacts on the organizational form that a corporation takes, as well as the people that it serves, the interests that it serves, and how it operates too. So yeah, I think it's really important to see corporations as entwined with states and society as well, and how they operate, not just to look at them as unitary, entities, and certainly to see them as not just controlling, but parts of networks as well. So I probably overemphasize that control aspect, but definitely they do have some control in the networks that they operate in too. all of this, of course, is contentious. I mean, one of the criticisms I had early on when I was writing it was I was at a conference where I really got quite attacked by somebody in the audience who was a very staunch Marxist who said the corporation is not an actor, and you've got to look at the elites, and you've got to look at those who actually sort of like that the corporation's just a form. But if you wanted to understand political power and the actors that are involved, you had to have a class-based way of looking at that. And I said, yeah, sure, that's one way of doing it. But, when we talk about the state and the state acting and the state as an actor, that's an abstraction as well. I mean, like, in what sense does a state act, as opposed to sort of like the groups within it? So there's always some abstraction involved. But it seemed to me, and this goes to the point that Emanuele was making before, because of the sort of like analytical lenses that we have, we tend to sort of see too much of the time that like a corporation, a company, a firm is somehow sort of an economic actor or an actor in markets and not political unless it's in terms of market power and economic interests. That's part of the story, but I think also like, corporations have an interest in actually making the rules and in, getting to a stage where they can not just affect agendas, but set them and actually govern themselves. There's a struggle going on over the question of who governs. I think that's important to recognize.
Okay, thank you. Sorry if I misrepresented your work, but I think you got the point. So Gemma, do you have a question?
Yes. I wanted to thank all of you for your presentations. First of all, I thought they were really interesting and stimulating. So thank you. And I also want to pose a question. I will try to be brief since we don't have so much time. So in all of your works, there was some kind of reference to regulation. In John's work for the failure to regulate companies or the self-regulators character of multinationals. In Eleni's work for, of course, the regulation of finance. And in the case of Emanuele, for the case of what? The regulation authority in the UK. And I'm also interested in these regulation agencies. In particular, I'm thinking now about the regulation authority in Italy of public utilities. So the question is mostly addressed to Emanuele, but of course it's for all that want to intervene. So the claim of regulation agencies of public utilities is to be nor public nor private. Actually, the claim is to be equidistant and to both parties. So I'm wondering to what extent they're really so in terms of, also just the cultural norms, education, and revolving doors and material interests. So what I'm also wondering if there is a theoretical understanding across sectors of what regulation is in terms of the public and private debate. And secondly, I'm wondering about the role in public policy. Of course, I think all of us here agree that the role is not technical, but rather very much political. But my further question is, whether the role they carry out is the regulation of a market, or rather, in the end, by accumulating knowledge and networks, is also actually governing public policy. And so what is the aim of the organization in the end? So thank you. Sorry for being a bit long.
Thank you. Shall I go ahead? I'll try to, in a nutshell. Now, England is an interesting case because the Ofwat is the Office for Water Services, is the English economic water regulator, and it's the model. Everyone around the world looks at Ofwat as the as the model. It's certainly the most it's not only the reference and the benchmark, but it's also arguably the most powerful economic water regulator in the world. I mean, they employ around 200 professionals. They have a turnover of around 20 million quid. So apologies, pounds, British pounds. It is certainly one of the aspects of water privatization in England that has been more influential in terms of exporting policy ideas, more than the English model of privatization, which remains confined to a more limited. Now, what we can learn from the experience of Ofwat is this: even powerful, very powerful regulators like Ofwat, even when they are presented as independent, well, they might be, independent in the sense of relatively independent from Parliament. Ofwat is a ministry effectively, but they're not neutral. They're not politically neutral. And you have to understand that, for example, Ofwat was created to make privatization a success, and the way in which they interact with different actors, including the private water operators, shows that. To the extent that we wrote in a paper that they were lenient towards the powerful, the private companies, and they were inflexible towards the vulnerable, the water poor. Of course, things change, and Ofwat has been established almost 30 years ago. So, things change a long time, but I think that in a nutshell, we can say that when we're talking about this symbiotic relationship between the private sector and regulators, Ofwat is one example. Revolving doors, we have cases there, and definitely the fact that they have been established to make privatization a success. Definitely, it shapes their mission. And then, people may use what rhetorical expressions they want about their independence or their neutrality. When you look at the reality of fact, is that there is a neoliberal project here, which is in motion. Depending on the historical period, maybe Milton Friedman prevails in terms of saying, it's only business. In other periods, it's the same expression with a bit more of openness towards corporate social responsibility. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the hierarchy of interests, then an actor like Ofwat certainly privileges the private water operators, even if its remit formally includes protecting consumers and vulnerable consumers. And it is a function that Ofwat has tried to argue its way to give this responsibility to the state rather than Ofwat itself or other actors. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay, John. Very briefly, because we have
very briefly, just to follow on from what Emanuele said and to respond to your question, Gemma, about what is the aim of the regulation. Just a bit of an anecdote, really. I mean, what's interesting is that when I teach my subject, government, business and society, to senior undergraduate students, and I start off with, we read Milton Friedman's 1970 article about the social responsibility of businesses to maximize profits. And it's interesting because they all come in, by then they know that Milton Friedman was Satan and fundamentally evil, and done a lot of damage and is responsible for the privatization of everything. And it's certainly true. I mean, the kind of things that we're talking about with the privatization of everything, the handing all the power, to corporations, the private sector to do public services, the damage that was done to Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, the Washington Consensus, no doubt about it. But then you read what he says, and it actually says, business makes profits, the government in a democracy represents the citizens, makes public policy and regulations in the interests of citizens, and business adheres to those laws. And when they don't comply, there's penalties for non-compliance. And you read this and you sort of think like, that all sounds fine. But of course, that's not what happens at all, because the regulations today are increasingly not for the public and they're not for citizens. They're in order to enable private interests. And usually it's not small business. It's usually big business. So it's usually multinational corporations, you know, the big end of town. And it means that the big four professional services firms, companies like Deloitte's in the case of the United Kingdom, end up being responsible for rolling out vaccines and doing COVID tests and that kind of thing, which just makes my mind boggle. So, you know, and the argument around this is still made, as Emanuele just said, that like in one era, one thing was neoliberalism, and now this is what it's become, and it's still called neoliberalism. So I think we have to sort of get behind those terms to see what's really, really going on, because there ain't nothing liberal about it, let alone neoliberal, I would argue.
Oh, thank you. Does anyone have a final comment? Or Eleni, or I see Phil has, no, Eleni's fine. So if Phil wants to speak very briefly, yeah, we can.
Yeah, I just want to say that so many people have written about neoliberalism, and does neoliberalism imply less state or more state? Is the state imposing the market on the economy? And I mean, I've written about that, so I just think you might want to follow some of the other literature that I cite and that's really out there. They're saying that the market economy is something that is imposed by the state.
I cite you, Phil.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we are done. Thank you very much for the very interesting comments and explanations. We will try to bridge this work on creating some new research on transnational governance. And thank you for all the audience also. We had like a quite nice audience. And yeah, let's, so not forget to invite you for the next seminars. We have 2 more seminars on this year at least. One on cultural management and international multicultural management, and the other one on the new character of war. So you are invited. We will share broadly on the net, on Twitter and so on. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you. Night, night.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye. Thanks.
È andato tutto bene? Everything is fine.
Yes, very nice.
Yes, I think so.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for
Thank you for staying with us.
or